Christians are maybe good, or people who have any religion are good at imagining the impossible. And that relates to like abolitionism, or that relates to being a communist, being a Marxist, of this sense of we deserve a better world. And if faith can, and it can also do the exact opposite, help put you in a mindset for that, to me that's been really valuable.
There's got to be more to life than Deliveroo, Netflix, and getting ghosted on the apps. But is that thing Christianity? Okay, I am being deliberately facetious. But with more and more young people losing faith in the promise of liberal capitalist consumerism and the resurgence of a certain kind of Christianity, are the signs pointing towards an overall revival of religion? And does signing up for God mean abandoning reason, science, and tolerance? I'm joined by Lamorna Ash, author of Don't Forget We're Here Forever, to talk about her exploration of 21st century Christianity. She spent 3 years going to Bible classes, Christian retreats, and even the odd nunnery to find out whether modern life is compatible with the teachings of Christ. We talk about celibacy, whether you can interpret scripture literally, and whether or not people doing modern religion are in fact just participating in individualist pick and mix. I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I did. Lamorna Ash, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. So your book, Don't Forget We're Here Forever, it's going to be out by the time this comes out, but it's not yet. So I'm very excited to be able to talk about it with you. How are you feeling in this like weird, like liminal purgatory period before it comes out?
Purgatory feels right. I feel nervous. I had to do the audiobook last week, which is like, I don't know if you did yours.
Yeah.
It's like a uniquely humiliating moment when you realize you can't pronounce like half the
Anything.
words. Yeah. What was it? Ascetic. Just struggled over that again and again. Apostasy, still can't get it. But it meant like going through it and suddenly realizing the arc of it and being like, as you're writing it, you have a sense of where you're going, but to hear the whole thing in one go, I think it's so valuable to do, but it's also so strange to be like, this weird thing of like this constellation of all these ideas I came up with is now fixed into something. It's really weird.
I mean, it's one of the things that I'm only sensitive now to because I've like written a book, which is before when I was doing downstreams, I was like, this finished product that you have made. Whereas actually, that's just when you've submitted the manuscript and the idea keeps on evolving and changing. I mean, we're going to get into the meat of the book, but since submitting the manuscript, are there things which have been like living and febrile and moving for you?
Definitely. And I think so. Simon Critchley talks about this in his new book on mysticism, about where he looks at loads of female mystics, so people like Julian of Norwich, who I write about. And this sense of the...
Who's that? Just for the audience.
Julian of Norwich is this medieval mystic, and she had these extraordinary revelations when she was dying, when she was about 30. And then
bad time to have revelations.
All good time. It sort of saved her. Hard to say. But the whole thing is, so she had these revelations that were mostly about the fact that God is love and that all will be well. And it was this way that particularly female mystics were able to... They weren't able to access like the priesthood, like anything in terms of like clerical status, but they could have these direct interrelational things with God and then gain power that way. And it was like one of the only ways a woman could have power. So she locked herself off in an anchor hold and she lived there for the rest of her life, basically trying to understand what these properly like psychedelic ayahuasca infused revelations of like God with this crown dripping and all these things that she saw. But when you read it, and what Simon Critchley talks about is the fact that this female author is constructing her version of what happened. And there's something about writing where it's like you're freezing in time, a constantly changing thing. And I think a relationship with religion, if you have a religion that's really like doubt fueled, which I think mine is, to end up somewhere, you have to be like, oh, I choose to end here. And I read James Wood, who writes lots for the LRB. He wrote this, and he was brought up in an evangelical church. And he talks about some books that don't come down anywhere, and the need to try and be a bit brave and make some kind of like Kierkegaardian leap in a book. So I was like, okay, I really want to end this book with a choice. Like I want to be, everyone I interviewed was so brave, so I'm going to try and do the same. And now I'm like reading that aloud. I was like, and I think Jesus really was resurrected. And I'm like, wow, do I? I did in the moment. And I do some days, but not all the time.
I mean, so the book starts because you wrote this long piece for The Guardian, and you were sat in your flat and you were like, what do I write about? Oh, there's this kind of like weird bit of gossip that I know, which is that two friends who you knew from uni,
Yeah.
is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Had sort of not only become Christian, but were entering the priesthood. And it was interesting to me that when you put yourself back in that moment of learning it for the first time, you didn't try and give it more significance than it had to you at the time. You're like, oh, it's a piece of gossip. So how did it go from something which was maybe like a curio, this sort of like weird thing going on with like some people you know, to being a real object of study and curiosity and investigation?
I think the kind of research that I do, where you end up interviewing people multiple times and it's so immersive, it means that you start living alongside people. And I have this sense of eventually, if you're porous enough, that's going to start changing you. And there's only so long, if you're spending hours at a time going to meet people, listening back to their interviews multiple times, that you can hold the stance of like, this person is purely foolish. Like, how can they believe in this thing? And quite quickly with both of them, I thought, there's so much more to this. And then everything starts collapsing because you're like, oh, well, as soon as I have this sense that one faith, you start thinking about all religions differently. And it felt this like a sort of exciting moment of things coming into a new way of thinking about the way religion worked. And then I remember at the same time, my friends, because I was constantly leaving parties early because I was like, oh, I've got to go to church with these guys I'm interviewing tomorrow morning. And it's like 3 a.m. And my friends were like,
Okay, do you say leaving parties early? I mean, maybe it's because I'm a couple of years older than you. I'm like, 3 a.m.
okay, I'm just showing off because I'm
Lord have
on the radio.
mercy.
Not really, not really. It's like 1 a.m., whatever. Sometimes I make it to 3.
I'm in bed by 10 and I've got my bed socks on. The socks are on.
I mean, I am mostly, but I think I'm desperately trying to retain the idea that I'm that kind of person. But I did go to a few parties while I was writing the book and then did have to go early to church. And I remember my friends, I think there's like this like slightly contrarian bit to me occasionally where my friends would say, oh, what are you doing? Like, why? You don't need to actually do that for the research. And I kept thinking like, why are you so anti this? There's so much, I'm learning there's so much more to it than the kind of loud, like, the really simple version we get of Christianity tends to be the version that comes from America, that it's most conservative, like vociferous voices, homophobic, transphobic. And as soon as I was seeing there were other things, it made me so much more keen to research it further.
I mean, I want to, I guess, get into that doubleness of like the kind of life you were living socially and then like what was happening to you in terms of your journey through faith and through religion. But just to go back to these like two friends, who were they when you knew them? And what was it that you discovered and encountered when you met them again and they were being ordained?
So neither of them actually ended up being ordained. And they've now
Oh.
both, I think, become Catholics. So they've had this sort of shift within it. But at the time, it was like this discernment process, which is quite long in the Church of England, wanting to become priests. But we were all at uni. Everyone was searching for some kind of meaning, some kind of identity to pin to themselves. And they were comedians. And they came out of university. And like all of us had that really traumatic post-university, what am I doing? And I tend to think that men that I know experience that in a more dramatic way than women, where perhaps like women already there's less expectations on them and they come out into the world and are like, okay, this is going to be hard. But I didn't have this social standing that I think boys at university still can sort of float through and come out the other end and go, this is terrifying. What am I going to do now? And I think for both of them, really intellectual, thoughtful guys were like, didn't people used to turn to the church for answers? Isn't there that space? And maybe there's this idea of like approaching it intellectually, like through reason or through the heart that Blaise Pascal talks about. And I think for them, it was reason with a desperate desire to get to the heart. And I could feel them slowing down and changing in lots of ways. And even now, though, it's a particular type of Christianity where I wasn't asking them so much how it was changing things like their politics, but I was noticing that it was simplifying things for them and giving
In what
them
kind of way?
it was giving them this rooting and this sense of like there is this grand narrative through which to perceive the world or understand the world that can give you community, that can give you a kind of density or depth to meaning. And that's what I think intrigued them and fascinated them. And the more I interviewed them, the more that was kind of becoming a larger aspect of their lives. And I think I write in the introduction that it both amazed me and scared me, because as I've got older, I have this sense of I'm getting closer to the kind of life I want. Like, I have now this group of friends who are amazing and radical and push me, and I've, I guess, like, come out and all these things that have happened. And I had this idea that to become religious, you'd have to lose so much. And I was so resistant to that, because I was like, no, I'm just getting there. It's just getting good. And I think, so what that meant was I wanted to write a book, because I was like, I think there's other ways of doing this. I don't think you then have to become celibate and just get married and maybe have a small nuclear family.
Or celibate and married. I mean, that does happen.
Yeah, I know. Worst of both worlds. Sounds awful.
I mean, just to go back to like where you were at the beginning of writing, were you interested in God before you became interested in the stories of these two people in your friendship group?
Not on a conscious level, but when I look back at in studying, it was often the religious figures. Like, I talk about Jared Manley Hopkins a lot in the book, because he's my guy. He's like my favorite poet, and I just think he's amazing. But this sense
of deep cut.
Yeah, exactly.
A deep cut.
Yeah, he is. He's good. But this, with him, you could feel the wrestling of faith in his poetry, and it's what gives it life. And then you start to realize that everyone, like, even just reading Shakespeare plays at university and being like, oh, you all were religious, and there's this like tension that undergirds all your writing, or like D.H. Lawrence, or what George Eliot is like thinking about within Middlemarch, whether she remains a Christian or not, but this fact of what religion is.
Novara Media can't live on the Holy Spirit alone. We need your tithes. So go to novara.media.com/support. And the thing that we ask for is for you to give the equivalent of 1 hour's worth of your wage per month. But anything you can afford is deeply, deeply appreciated. I'll keep you in my prayers.
And I think also, I don't know, I was a very imaginative kid, and I had these like moments of like real horror of like what the world, like, so these, I guess, like, not spiritual crises, but crisis of meaning and what on earth I was doing. I guess just like quite an angsty kid. And so I think that there was something in me that maybe like was less resistant to it than other people, but there wasn't anything particular. Like, I'd go to church. I got confirmed because I just decided it was a good idea. My family were like, really? Are you sure? Like, we're not religious. You don't need to. And I was like, no, I just think I might need it one day.
Oh, like the way people sometimes join their trade union, where they're like, well, I'm not really like into the union thing, but like, I might get harassed by my boss at some point. So it's good insurance.
Yeah. Insurance, preventative measure as well. Of like, and I think also then you get to go and take the communion as well. And I was like, oh, maybe I want to do that one day. So.
Oh yeah, it seems cool. Like when you see other people eating and drinking something, I'm like, I want,
yeah,
I want that to be me. I mean, when we were growing up, I mean, Richard Dawkins and that new atheist movement was a really big thing. Did you ever get drawn into it? Did you ever, start Bible bashing with your copy of The God Delusion? Because I did. It was really embarrassing.
I mean, we all were like that at that age, because you're taking really simple arguments, and that thing of Dawkins and his ilk fighting against the God of the simplest form, like that, it's a real straw man kind of God. They're like, okay, I can easily disprove this because they're not looking very deeply. And I'm sure I had so many arguments like that as a kid, where I was like, okay, well, I'm frightened of being stupid here, and so I'm going to go with that simple argument. But I'm not sure it was quite Dawkinsian. And I wonder if we were like just after that, like it was slightly earlier noughties. Like, I didn't get that much Hitchens until later. But I definitely didn't think it was
Which Hitchens?
Oh, sorry, Christopher Hitchens. Yeah.
It's going to be like two very, very different.
Yeah, and I mean, because I still love some of the things that Christopher Hitchens says around God. I think he is actually thoughtful, intelligent about it. But I think, I didn't really consume much of that. I don't think I cared enough. Like, I really think so many awakenings happened to me quite late, in like early 20s, that I wasn't thinking about what my relationship was with the world. I wasn't thinking about faith. I don't know, yeah.
So a lot of people in our audience, I think, would probably class themselves as atheists and agnostics, and maybe would have a criticism of religion, saying, well, this is a way of keeping people oppressed and credulous, and it dampens their ability to reason and to critique. And it also makes them accept that suffering is their lot in life, rather than believing in the power of collective action. I suppose I've got two questions. One is, has that ever been a descriptor of your belief? And two, is it still in any way?
Okay. I think because with the Marx quote of like, the opiate for the masses, this sense of that he's talking about religion, which to me does feel different from what Christianity and faith are. And I think the institution of Christianity does do that. But again, there's so many different forms of Christianity, it becomes harder and harder to say one thing about it. You will find like a bunch of Marxist atheist Quakers who still go to Quaker meetings every week. And it's like a really foundational part of their community and their politics as well. And then you'll find a kind of Christianity that does have this emphasis on suffering and this sense of, I always think about Methodism, and E.P. Thompson wrote this great thing about the way that John Wesley, who was a Tory, he put so much emphasis on the working class who are joining these churches of your life is, you are bad, it's all individual, nothing about anything structural at all. And if you're in the pub, you're bad, and if you go to church, you're good. And it was a tool of oppression, and it still can be used in that way. And the onus on the individual, and your sinning is the thing that's the problem. This sense of, again, what about a relational understanding of sin, of suffering, of how we get to where we are? So I think if I thought that Christianity was just that, which I definitely did at the start, then I wouldn't have touched it with a barge pole, and that's probably why I didn't. So I think we have this sense now of not wanting to align yourself with institutions that have all this darkness to them. And I think there's something about getting older and like understanding what it means to be British and saying, okay, I have to like hold on to this like colonial legacy. You go abroad and you're constantly reminded of what it means to be British, and that you hold on to that. It's important to know that, and you move forward with it and say, okay, how can I be different? And I think with Christianity, quite a lot of my mates are like, I don't want to join another thing that has this colonial history, that has been this tool for imperialism, that has constant sex abuse scandals still, and there's more to come out. And then what I think on the other side is that maybe our generation is better at saying, I can join something, I can join a faith system without needing to also say that I therefore agree with everything in that institution. Our relationship with the state feels different and more distant, and saying that I am a person here who can find beauty and community within this on like really molecular level of like the church itself, beautiful, great churches where there's people that you would never come into contact with, that feels so removed from what's happening in like the upper echelons, where they are doing terrible things, continuing to do terrible things, trying to change, failing to change in some ways.
So I want to talk a bit about the book and your experience of going to Bible study classes. Oh, yeah. And you start out with the assumption that, okay, well, like Bible 101 is going to be Bible 101 anywhere. They're going to teach you the same stuff, like Genesis is still Genesis and the Gospel of Mark is still the Gospel of Mark. One, was that the case? And two, what was it like for the first time stepping into a kind of Bible study group? Because if it was me, I sometimes feel very self-conscious about the fact that I'm doing things from a kind of cognitive perch, and I'm not really participating because I'm wanting to be an observer, and then I feel like a complete fraud and like kind of like an asshole. Like, I don't know, like did you have any of those fears?
That's like the constant tension with everything when I'm as a writer, when you're going into spaces and you're both there to discover things, but you always have this backseat thing because you're like, well, I'm taking this on for something else. I think also I had so many things going into this Bible studies group. You're on one table, there's like soft jazz music as you come in, you have your dinner together.
Soft jazz.
Yeah, it was very low purple lighting, just like that. It's like real elevator music.
Amazing.
And you sit down, and I think also this like swotty bit to me where I like also really wanted to do well. Like I really wanted to answer the questions right. And
I wanted an A-star in Bible.
I wanted an A-star in Bible, and I was getting it all wrong because I didn't know how to read it.
So how do you read it? Because I think, again, like if I'm trying to ventriloquize like some of our audience, whether it's the Bible or the Quran, they'll be like, okay, are you telling me Muhammad flew off on a flying horse? Like, for real? Like, you telling me that Jesus on the third day come out the cave is like, I can't remember what Jesus actually says. I imagine it's like, what up? But like...
Yeah. That was it. Exactly. Verbatim.
Yes. But like, I guess they would be saying that like the only way you can read it is literally. Was that how you engaged with it, or was it different?
Well, so again, in certain evangelical churches, more conservative evangelical churches, you have to read it as literal truth, that there's like a line in the letter to Timothy that says that this is God breathed, like everything within scripture is literal truth. That's the kind of headline. But in reality, and what I liked about Bible studies is that people are having their really particular relationship with it, where you're even wondering what we all mean by truth as you're just reading it and saying, like, there was this amazing bit. There's a bit when Jesus comes back and he's got obviously a stigmata and he's got sort of holes in him. And doubting Thomas does not believe that it's really Jesus.
He's like, oh yeah, come let me look then.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, come let me look.
But Jesus is like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, stick your hand in me, which again feels like weirdly erotic. But anyway, there's lots of that in the Bible, and has to put his finger right through him. And some of the people on the table in my Bible studies group, one of them was like, I just don't believe that happened. And his wife was like, I do believe that happened. And this American guy, who is the kind of like godfather figure of the table, said, now, you know, folks, this is what Christians will argue about. And there was all this sort of funny, cute stuff with that. But constantly we were trying to work out what we think Jesus meant. And that requires imaginative work, like any kind of a literary analysis does. And I think then this sense of like when people were understanding of like who wrote each Bible book and when, what like more advanced literary or biblical criticism did was mean that if you were a slightly more progressive Christian, you couldn't hold on to the idea that this was all literal truth. And I think I went in with this sense of, I take very seriously novels and like probably read them as if they are like truth, but a different kind of truth. And I didn't really struggle with that. And so for me, there were just like these beautiful moments in the story. Like I think the bit when Christ is on the cross and he says these lines that are like in English are translated as, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then we were told that those lines come from a psalm, so from the Old Testament, written by the Hebrew authors. And then trying to understand what that meant of like, okay, there's 4 or 5 ways you could look at why he says those lines. One is that the author of Mark's Gospel put those lines in to give the Bible more authority, to say, look, it's so connected to the Hebrew Bible, and to say that this is this religion continuing on. Another is that Christ knew the Psalms intimately. He'd probably said them every day. And so that he, in his last moment, would want to say those lines. Another is that you could kind of imagine, go like quite wacky with it and think, well, if the whole sense of time is like distorted by the meaning of if Christ is the Son of God, then actually possibly his entry into the world then like retroactively changes the way that the psalm would have been, or the psalm would always be hinting towards a Christ who is to come. And there's kind of room for play in it,
like
in that way.
Tenet.
It's just like Tenet, and then they all walk back.
And they all walk backwards. Christopher Nolan discovers the rewind button. I mean, there's something interesting here for me about you being like kind of amongst this table, and you've got this American guy being like, well, it's just what Christians argue about. Do you think that maybe you found that religious people maybe had a higher tolerance for and a greater acceptance of incoherence than maybe you did, and that maybe there's something about when you come from a more secular background, you've been trained to analyze text in a particular way at university, is that you sort of view contradiction or incoherence as a bit of a gotcha, and you're like, aha, like I've won, like I've dominated this text. And normal people are like, well, there's lots in life that's kind of incoherent and I can accept it.
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think that is, it's funny, this book coinciding of this sense of growing up and kind of hitting your 30s and needing to have like less of a hard carapace on loads of things, and this fear of being wrong or the fear of being uncertain starts to melt. And I think that was, I had this sense, I had this loads of times. Like I had this when I was hanging out with lots of nuns in Walsingham in Norfolk, which is the one place the Virgin Mary's touched down in Britain. That's why it's a site of pilgrimage. And I'd read these like amazing bits.
What's she doing in Walsingham?
I don't know. She came there in like the 12th century, and she said to this lady, please, can you build a replica of the house where I bore Jesus, or the house where the angel Gabriel came to me and said that I was going to have a son. Mm-hmm. And this woman was like, okay, that's really specific, but sure, I'll build this for you. And so they have this chapel there, this sacred site. But when I was there, reading all these things that like explain some of the patriarchal context of why Mary is seen the way she is, why we think she's a virgin, coming from one line in the Old Testament, And I'd have these sense of, okay, I've understood. And then I'd meet with someone and my academic jargon that I just learned did nothing to them. And they were like, I get that, but it's so miraculous to believe that she was a virgin. And my faith, and I met this amazing trans academic, he's Catholic, and he was like, yeah, like I constantly have to refresh that idea of believing in something that is so unlikely. And obviously then someone like me who's like, well, I've just been working it out and I just proved it was wrong. I felt really silly, and I was kind of amazed by it, because I often use love and faith as like a good comparisons of, you are believing in something that you both need to believe in together, that feels beyond any kind of like intellectual reason. And it takes work to like daily continue that process of loving someone. And it feels kind of mystical. And I think I started to get that sense of faith the more research I did, the more I met people. And I felt like less I needed to then defend this very basic understanding of Christianity I'd got, and instead go like, tell me, like, what's your mystery? Like, how do you understand this?
I mean, I can't remember who it was who said it, but I know that you quote from it in the book. Someone who says, no one wants to be found amongst the ranks of the credulous or something. So it's like, well, no one wants to feel like they're a gullible idiot, basically. Do you think that there's something, again, about, kind of like more middle class, university educated, that so much of our sense of self is wrapped up in being skeptical, discerning, right, intellectually right, and that maybe not everyone comes to faith with the same magnifying glass of looking for the mistake so that they can feel clever?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think with that, you start to realize that it's a different form of understanding that still takes a ton of work. But I think all of us, when you're among other people and you're slightly being gradually changed by them as time goes on, you start to realize that it is a different form of truth that you're discovering within a church, I think.
I mean, so I want to get back to your indoctrination into Bible study. So you talked to this guy called Rico Tice, which is such a great name. And one of the things that you're sort of wrestling with him over is who gets to decide what is good and what isn't good. And he's got this criticism of the culture, as he puts it. So what were his criticisms of the culture? Where did that come from? And did you find any surprising points of agreement with him?
Well, I guess it's pure culture wars stuff of this sense of the world is accelerating towards this like liberal horror that for him began in the 1960s with the sexual revolution, which he then tied up in this idea that rape culture and things. And the answer to this is always the focus is on men. The answer to this is that men need to understand more about sin. They need to be celibate until marriage. It's never this sense of, what if you took women more seriously and were taught, educated in schools of how to be respectful of consent, all these like really simple tools. And he relates that to this idea that Christianity is then this return, this kind of imagined return to a mythic past that doesn't quite exist, where there was greater equality because we all lived in a more traditional way. In terms of whether I found anything that I aligned with him on, I really struggled with him. And I think I went in with this sense of, he began on the first Bible studies class, which was, just about the beginning of Mark, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, where he said that he was talking about the gay people in the community and the congregation, and he loves them, everyone loves them, and they're gay and they're going to be celibate for the rest of their lives. And I find it almost impossible not to switch off from that moment, because to me, that is such a reduction of what I think Christianity can be.
How did it feel being a queer person in that space?
I think I didn't talk about it for the first 2 sessions, and then I had an absolute outburst because, again, the people on my table were lovely and I was getting to know them, and they disagreed with most of the ways that I was telling them that I lived, telling them quite openly that I lived, but at the same time were like accommodating, and I could never quite work out an end point of that, being like, oh, you're great and you're generous, and they got me a birthday cake on my 28th birthday, and it was lovely, but also this sense of feeling like you're in this space and you suddenly feel like you're then, I don't know, I felt angry with it because Dermot McCulloch, who's one of my favorite, or probably, he's just this amazing Christian historian. And he had this sense of being brought up in the church. His parent, his grandfather, his father were both priests, and realizing he was gay, and then getting to university and having his first relationship and saying, oh, I can literally work out in my own heart that this is not wrong. And starting from that point, and this idea of trying to discover what sin is. During this research, I was thinking that I have this like clear sense of when I've messed up in my life and I've like fucked up and hurt someone and it feels bad and I've wronged someone. And then suddenly saying, okay, someone else calls that sin. But there are these certain things that I know don't do harm that are like wonderful and great around sexuality that I can't believe they call it sin. I just can't believe it.
I mean, that bit where you're writing about the birthday cake was really interesting to me, because I think you said something like, you know, you can't just say you love people and get them a chocolate cake, but then also condemn them. And I was sitting with that and I was thinking about it and I was like, okay, but what about this? That line is saying we accept the people, we don't accept the identity. And I think that particularly if you move in like millennial and Gen Z, very progressive, big city circles, there's a lot of affirmation of identity and there is very little acceptance of people. And there's actually very high levels of judgment. There's very intense social exclusion and ostracism, and there's absolutely no forgiveness whatsoever. I mean, isn't, the sort of chocolate cake homophobe like maybe a little bit nicer than someone who says, well, I accept your identity, just not the real person that's in front of me?
Yeah, I really like that. And I think this is the thing of the book being finished and then continuing a year later on this journey of what does it even mean to say that they condemn my sexuality? If, like, as you say, they're generous, they're saying, come back to this place, we get on with you. It sounds great that you're in love, and I can understand that because I'm also in love with my partner, that it almost makes the idea that then saying you're condemned feel valueless because we're living in the here and now alongside people. And you're so right that then that sense of actually I'm going to be generous to you here means a lot more. Yeah, I think I have noticed that way more. And I was talking to this amazing Catholic Marxist recently, and I think I had this sense of needing to join a church. And again, this I think is to do with growing up, needing to join a church where people had similar views to me, and I could hear that they were going to do like prayers for Palestine within the service, and be queer affirming. And I still think that feels important in the place I've ended up. But in a big Catholic church, you're holding in a space people who are pro-abortion, anti-abortion, people who are trans and passing, people who are queer, and they're all together receiving communion together. And again, I think this is why religion is so interesting now, because it feels rare where you get to do that and actually be alongside each other. It kind of makes me think of protests as well, of these spaces where in that moment you're all there for one thing together. And sure, you have a million different contexts, and yet there is this sense of like you're looking for a same future. And I went to this, I'm just always going to churches, really. It seems to be my whole life. But I went to this LGBTQ service at Farm Street in central London in Mayfair, Sunday evening, very weird, completely empty in the streets. And again, it's this space where it's some people who just turn up and maybe they're traveling and they just want to find a Catholic church. And it's some people who go particularly to this because they're queer. And some old people who are just there, and it starts and says, oh, this is the LGBTQ service. And people are gradually changed in that of being, we all have this same faith that points us in one direction, you and I together alongside each other. And I found, I'm not sure if maybe I started to get there in the book, but I feel I've got closer to that understanding now.
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting that you point out, again, very early, is that the attendance of liberal congregations is falling, while for conservative congregations, attendance is on the increase. I mean, why do you think that is? You would think that, modern values are ones which really prioritize autonomy, the ability to sort of set your target for who you want to be and like go at it, whereas conservative congregations, it's much more... there's a lot more scaffolding, shall we say, shaping where it is you go and how it is you behave. So why is it that the conservative ones are sort of on the up and liberal ones are on the down?
Maybe it relates that autonomy thing of, if it is about where do I need to go in my life, there's maybe not so much space to say, I'm going to go to church on a Sunday morning. it's not going to say, like with mindfulness, maybe like make me a more efficient worker. I can't work out the value of it for me to like progress in my career or in other parts of my life. And so possibly there's this sense that in certain like liberal spaces, what is the value of a church then? Whereas with a conservative church, I think all of us, this moment of feeling that the world is in Britain increasingly atomized. I have so much time alone. I don't have a sense of community. I'm moving from flat to flat around London. And this church that says to you, come in and you here will have a home. You can come back to us. We will support you. We will give you this scaffolding when the world feels scary. That's quite an extraordinary thing and quite a rare thing. And I think the difference, I mean, people write about this when they talk about church decline of, if you're giving people more moral clarity and saying, if you come here, if you get baptized, it will take a very quick amount of time. You can then be saved and you're going to be okay. And that is quite a seductive thing to hear. And I think with more, and again, the liberal conservative thing, obviously there's so much more variety of churches within it, but to kind of simplify it that way, within liberal churches, there's no proselytizing. Someone is less likely to say, you're going to be okay if you come.
Proselytizing is
sort of encouraging you, almost like an advert speak, to come back and say you have to become a Christian. You know, so you think of the people maybe in Camden who are there with their megaphone saying, "Become a Christian, or you're going to die in sin."
Yeah,
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Also, I think I've been pronouncing that word wrong my whole life.
I might have just pronounced it wrong.
I thought it was proselytizing, but
it is.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't need like.
I did it in the audio book, right? I'm sure, and now I've forgotten it again. Can't hold on to any ways of pronouncing
That's
anything.
fine.
Anyway, proselytizing. Oh no,
it's how God made you. It's fine.
yeah. We're all unique, and fallible. Yeah, but I think so with liberal churches, you're less likely for someone to say, come back.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Quaker meeting house in Highgate for about 6 months, and it's this beautiful silent space, mostly older people, and they really don't want to put anything on you. And so it means that there's less of this demand to come back. So I think that's maybe part of it.
But isn't that a bit, maybe this is just the Bengali in me, but the idea of being in a space where everyone's quiet and I'm not sure if people really want me there sounds fucking terrifying. And it's sometimes quite English, right? Where everyone's so afraid of stepping on each other's toes that no one says anything. Whereas, loud brown people, like, you're kind of being like put in a headlock and like given a samosa, but it's very, very clear that like people want you to be there, and it can be overwhelming and it can be very domineering, but there's a, you're sure that you wanted.
Okay, yeah. I think it's so far from the way that they'd think about a Quaker meeting, which is like, by sitting in the silence together and saying this space is for everyone, but if anyone wants to talk, it's welcoming in this really different way. And you're right, it can be really disorienting. But one of my friends who I met from the book, Lawrence, who's a Quaker, he talks about the fact that there's this radical equality in Quaker meetings. And as an anti-capitalist socialist, as he calls himself, everywhere when he's doing union work, when he's picketing, he's looking for an equality that doesn't exist. But you enter a Quaker meeting and it's already founded on that. There's no preacher, there's no hierarchy whatsoever. And I think what it means to have this hour of silence, like, it's so rare for us to get an hour of silence, to have your phone away, that it feels like a generous space. But again, I say that as someone who's white, and most people there are white. But I think what they're doing in that space...
I love white people. I just don't like quiet people.
Yeah, okay, well, then maybe don't go. I don't think Lawrence doesn't like quiet people either, and he hates being quiet. And I think he finds the silence like an interesting challenge of like how you really think and like how you share the space with people. And if someone does stand up and says something, you then have 30 minutes to think about what that person has said, because maybe no one else will speak. And again, it's really rare to have that, where you're just like listening to what this person is saying. But there were times, and also occasionally, I really don't want to be with my brain for an hour. And I found that really difficult. And then that was why after that, I was like, I think I want to find a church that maybe feels more, it's got a bit more life to it. I want a bit of like, I want some hymns.
Yeah, get some hymns.
And it's a nice hymn, yeah.
I mean, there was an interesting thing that you said, which is... that the idea of spending 20 years committed to one thing is terrifying, and that you're naturally inclined to think about your life in these much shorter periods of like, moment to moment, minute to minute, hour to hour. What's it like when you're having to not just think about the idea of what a lifelong commitment to a church or a faith might mean, but sort of, a period of time up to and including in eternity. Um, what's that like for someone who's smartphone pilled?
I think, again, it depends on the Christian if they're thinking about life going up to eternity. I think so many Christians I meet are much more present, this world, material life focused. But it still is this challenge to say, I'm going to stick with this, whether you're thinking about eternity or whether you're just thinking for the rest of my life, I want to try and stay in this one thing. That feels like a challenge in itself as well, because life changes so much. We know that there's constant upheaval in so many aspects of life. And I asked someone, I was like, what terrible thing would have to happen within, say, the Church of England for you to actually leave? And she was like, so much horrible shit does happen. And I think at this point, my faith feels strong enough that I would stay regardless, because I've already learned to make peace with the fact that it's this difficult institution. And I think for me, that sense of so the church, I've ended up going to this church, which is a real spoiler for the end of the book, but it's something about each Sunday, knowing that I go there. And very quickly, once you get to know the community and like you have your like multiple old lady, old dude friends who you're like, I want to keep going because I feel like I have this commitment that we're sort of like mutually bound to each other. And that feels exciting because I have that with so few things, like the yoga studio I occasionally go to. They don't care if I don't come back. It's for me to pay them. And I think...
My yoga teacher really likes me.
Oh,
actually.
really?
She really likes me.
Wow, that is so... I'm just so bad. I don't think I've ever got there.
She's like grinning at her in Updog, like begging for her approval the whole time.
And then occasionally she'll be like, Ash, you've done so well. It's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's a good equivalent. It's the same thing.
Maybe.
But I think... Yeah, it is rare to have somewhere where you say, I'm going to stick. I'm going to stay this and like stay with it. And yeah.
I mean, do you think that we're trying to recreate religion in secular ways all the time, whether it's wellness stuff or whether it's, the kind of like no fap thing, like amongst the manosphere, or like, I've got friends who are really into tarot, which I find funny. I love them. I love them, but I'm just like, what? Why are you letting these cards tell you what to do? But like, we're constantly trying to recreate structures where something or someone is telling us what to do and how to live and saying there is a plan for you and you just have to follow it. And yet we don't like it when it's Jesus, but we're fine if it's like some rando on TikTok.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the reason behind it is that life is like terrifying and complicated and endlessly gets harder. And that's so scary. And looking anywhere for someone to say, this is how to live, you're going to be okay. There's this pattern. There's this thing coming. It's going to be all right. Is such a comfort or a balm for all of us. I guess when I think about the difference between things like wellness is that, again, it is individual oriented, and tarot is like those cards are just for you. And this sense with faith, I mean, again, it really depends on the kind of faith you subscribe to. But the faith I'm in, I don't think I'm ever going to be told, like, this is what the pattern of your life is. But what it's doing instead is and it does do some of the things.
Do you feel like there's a plan for you?
No, I don't think so. I don't think about it at all. I don't think there is a plan for me. But
God had one for Drake, but not you. That's sad.
Yeah, I guess like if I was like a famous rapper or something, maybe I'd have more. There's more of a plan.
More of a plan.
I think, yeah. What do I think about it? That when I go to this church, it does provide some of the things that say I might get from therapy or mindfulness, and that's that thing of slowing down and someone saying, think about just for a moment what you've done that week. Have you fucked up? And I really do. And I'm like, oh, I could have been kinder to that person. I was an asshole then. And then they just say, whatever it is, whatever it was, God forgives you, forgive yourselves, forgive each other. And I find like it properly feels like this escape valve released of being like, oh, okay. And I'm ready to go for the next week. And I think you can get that in loads of different other places, secular, lots of religions provide that as well. But I think the thing that really matters to me is that communal element that you're not getting in tarot, etc. That's saying, and you're all in this together, and we're all going to meet next week and talk about like what we struggled with, and actually often the cups of tea you have afterwards, in this space that, by being made vaguely sacred, you seem to have like deeper, more moving conversations with the people that you meet, because it's almost like you've been slightly opened up or like made a bit more raw during the service. That to me, that matters just as much, which is like, oh, we're all here together and how are you doing? And I know about your mum and you know about my family member who's ill. And it provides something that feels very different from like me going and seeing the psychic sisters or wherever they are.
I mean, how do you feel about the authority element of it? Because lots of people look to religious teachings, look to God, look to the church as a form of authority. And yes, there's comfort. Yes, there's community. Yes, there's a space for reflection and enough quiet that you can get a grip and change yourself and move in a kinder direction. But it's also, no, there is a source of authority here. Like, is that part of your faith?
If it is, it's the moral or ethical element of thinking of like the simple stuff of the Sermon on the Mount, of these simple rules given by Christ. It's so weird to talk about this because it's also new to me. I don't feel like I've got personally any authority to be saying any of this. I'm still working out my own
Would you
sense
say you're
of
a
faith.
novice?
I'm a novice. Yeah.
That's a nun joke for the audience at home.
Very good. I think for me, the sense of, again, early days, but of the command to like love one another, to love each other as your neighbor, that being the most important commandment, that feels like a beautiful form of authority that is worth remembering, that you don't need to be a Christian to get that. You don't need to be religious at all to get that. But it's at one of those spaces where they can remind you of that. And there was this thing, I think J.D. Vance said something recently about this idea of like using his new Catholicism and saying love happens in concentric rings. First of all, you love your family, and then you love your community, and then you love people outside of your country. And the Pope shot back and said, no, J.D. Vance, you're completely wrong, that we need to return to the Good Samaritan, which is like you love your neighbor, you love your enemy, you love someone who is different to you. There is not a hierarchy of love. You love everyone equally. That is what this faith is for. And I think if you could call that authority, I'm very moved by that and inspired by that. And like, hopefully I had that before, but I think having this weekly reminder of what that means in like a really radical way of being like, that extends everywhere.
Can I do a bit of poking?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you seem to be like quite happy with the bits of religious teaching, Christian teaching, which are likely to pose a challenge towards conservative nationalists like J.D. Vance. So the idea that you have to explode the concentric rings and love your neighbor and love your enemy, that's a challenge to J.D. Vance. But then isn't going back to the question of sex outside of marriage, right? Whether it's heterosexual sex or whether it's not, isn't that something which could be challenging to you and your system of values? And it's sort of, clear. It's like, you're supposed to do this within the context of a, marriage for the purposes of having kids. And you're like, no, I don't like that bit. So, J.D. Vance, religious teachings which are challenging are for you, but I'm just going to take the stuff which upholds my value system.
Yes. So we're all picking and choosing basically which bits speak to us. Yes, I think that is true. But I think the lines that actually say condemn homosexuality, which are in Leviticus, are so like in the Old Testament. And
there's loads of stuff in Leviticus, man.
Yes. Oh, it's kind of exciting, the stuff in Leviticus. There's so much. I mean, if when you're on your period, you really shouldn't be out, and so many things that are like often these rules.
No cloths of different fabric.
I'm failing that right now as well. It's the worst thing. But I think that anyway, the sense of like sex between men being an abomination, it being two lines in Leviticus, it potentially actually being in the context of, because it's about marriage, so instead it's about infidelity. But I think there's a real difference between, Christ never said anything about sexuality, but Christ's teachings being these sort of quite radical, quite beautiful things where he's just having these interactions with people. It's social. The whole faith is like people having these encounters with one another and being changed by them and taking them at face value. And to me, that has like meaning to it. But I'm sure it's like deeply hypocritical that I take some parts and not another. But I think, again, I don't see myself as like a voice piece for Christianity, nor do I want to persuade anyone else of it. it's something that I have found really useful. And as we're talking, I'm like, oh, it was all collapsing in my head. And that seems to happen all the time where I'm like, what am I doing? Why have I ended up here? And yet there's enough value in it. And it seems to be changing my life in a way that feels valuable enough that I want to stay. I just read Sean Faye's new book, Love in Exile. And she ends by talking, the last chapter, Agape, is about spirituality, and maybe both through her childhood and Catholicism, but also through going to Alcoholics Anonymous and what that means of where you're suddenly taught about spirituality or like this need to give something to a higher power. And she wrestles with it really beautifully of like what it means just to take spirituality to say, I choose to love someone who's really difficult. This agape is this like endlessly widening love that you can sometimes feel, or you could like, and she prays, and these like little things. And I think that's kind of where I am too. And I'm going to call it Christianity because that's the church I've ended up in. And maybe this makes me, I'm cheating by saying I then choose to take the bits of it that I want to. But I guess what I want to do in my life is like find meaning and have someone to direct my meaning towards. And I think in the last few years, my politics have felt more radical. My ways of living have felt, I think I know the kind of world that I want more, in this sense of Christians are maybe good, or people who have any religion are good at imagining the impossible. And that relates to like abolitionism, or that relates to being a communist, being a Marxist, of this sense of we deserve a better world. And if faith can, and it can also do the exact opposite, help put you in a mindset for that, to me that's been really valuable.
I mean, you're talking to a Muslim who drinks, all right? So when it comes to hypocrisy, I mean, I'm not, when we're pointing a finger, there's three pointing back at you. Could you talk to me a bit about one of the people who you spent a lot of time with interviewing, someone called Max, who joins an Eastern Orthodox church? Yeah. What's his story?
His story is that he was someone who, in the pandemic, he was working on a yacht as a chef. And during the pandemic, there was no work and they remained on the yacht. And he was heading towards quite a lot of conspiracy theories, and was very much like anti-vax, hated the constraints on his freedom, and was having a really hard time, like lots of family stuff going on at the same time, and had these breakdowns on the boat in 2020 and asked for God to welcome him in. And maybe for a few days that had some value and it felt like some opening in him. And then he would struggle all over again. And then a friend of his who was a vegetable seller for the boat saw him watching the YouTube videos of an Orthodox priest called Father Spiridon Bailey, and who has this really clear, quite dogmatic sense of what Christianity can be, usually aimed towards young men.
And what does he say?
I mean, loads of things. Again, loads of it relates around sex. You'd think this like massive, capacious, super strange religion, we all seem to, or people end up talking about sex so much. And he says that, the sins of the flesh, this need to step away from sinning, that the world, the liberal world, progressive world has gone mad. We need to return to prayer and certainty and fixity. And I think that was really compelling for Max. And then he went to this service, and I think having spent so much time alone, suddenly to be in the pews in a church in Nice, and all these people around him, and saying peace be with you, taking his hand, he found this community. And I think he has this sense that he's always felt a bit like an alien, he said to me, and that Christianity, the message is that you're not really from here. And so he found it really comforting to join this church. And again, to get this routine, to have someone who was checking up on you. And for all its negatives, I met a lot of people who were maybe had psychological problems they were going through, or felt very alone and isolated, who actually found and maybe should have been supported by social services that don't exist in the same way now at the moment in Britain, and would end up in a church where they would say, maybe with some stuff that to me seems more damaging, but also would say, we will take you in and we will hold you and we'll check up on you. And I think that can be so appealing to so many people.
I mean, just lingering on sex a little bit longer and the role of celibacy. What did you think when so many people were talking to you about celibacy, either as a quote unquote solution to living with the sin of same-sex desire, or saying, well, this is what I'm going to do until I find someone that I want to marry. I mean, what did you make of it?
What did I make of it? Again, it depends on the individual. I met this amazing woman called Helen, who runs this retreat center. She's a Christian in Birmingham. And she was telling me, just like in a really like nuts and bolty way, of what it meant to grow up in a church where you had to be celibate. And she met her husband and they remained celibate to marriage. And she could talk so easily about the pros and cons. The cons being that if you're taught that sex is this dangerous, sinful thing, to suddenly, after your marriage day, have to be like, and now we embrace it.
Do it.
Do it. Yeah, exactly. You have no practice, and it really is a practical skill. It takes a lot of, it's not theoretical. And I think for her, that was really challenging, like both emotionally and very literally, to be like, what are we doing here? But I think in other ways, she said that it taught her so much about patience with her partner. And when she does fancy other people, which happens because that's life, she's got used to.
Oh no, it happened to me. It doesn't happen to my husband.
Oh yeah, obviously, of course not. How could he? That you can hold off acting on those things. Other people, I don't know. I really don't have a concrete position on it. I don't want to sound wishy-washy with this stuff, but I did have this sense that when I was hanging out with quite a lot of nuns and I was interviewing them, and one of them was talking about she became a nun, and I just thought this line was really beautiful because she didn't want to miss her life. And in my head, I was like, but you're choosing to miss your life. Like by being a nun, there's so many possibilities. And maybe I was thinking a lot around love that you're going to miss out on. And you're also not cloistered in the sense of really, like a Carmelite nun where you'd be behind grating. These nuns are out in the world more than that, but you are still living in this small community. And she was saying that actually she can focus more on the world because of the fact that she's a nun, because she's not having all these like difficult, messy other relationships. And they read the news together at breakfast and they pray for the world. And there's this Trappist monk, 20th century Trappist monk.
What's that?
A Trappist monk is just a different type, a particular kind of monk with a lot of silence in their particular monasteries. And there's one, and he's called Thomas Merton, and he actually talks about the relationship between being a monk and being a Marxist in the sense of wanting a radical shift and transformation, his of the heart, a Marxist of society. And he became more and more unusual and spiritual over time about he wanted to be publicly in the world, but then he would have to have these retreats and he could never work out where he wanted to be. But sometimes celibacy and like genuinely choosing to prioritize friends or prioritize the world and whatever that might mean to you, I think can be really beautiful and valuable. It's not something I can do. And I really, on the way back from interviewing these nuns, I was in my car going home and I was like, oh, maybe I should become celibate because all my relationships have been so messy and I don't like how I've behaved a lot of the time. And I don't act with reason. I pursue all the wrong things. Wouldn't it really sort things out? And then on a more career level, I was like, I'd probably get way more writing done if I was celibate because I am always going out on these late night dates and being like, I don't know, desperately seeking love. I think I'm really want love in my life. And then I got home and I told all my mates, I was like, and I think they've been so generous and tolerant of me being like, guys, should I become celibate? And they were like, I don't think that's it. Like, if you want to give it a go, cool. And I think, again, Sean Fay wrote about being celibate for a year and it being really useful. But sometimes I have this sense of like what you learn a lot about in the Bible, of these desert periods where you go out into the silence. Maybe that's in a Quaker meeting, maybe that's a retreat, maybe it's a long holiday alone or a pilgrimage somewhere, in order to come back. Like, you are always going in order to bolster yourself or fortify yourself to get back in the world, because that's where everything's happening. And so I think if I thought about celibacy, it would be, again, maybe like what Sean Fay did, of having this moment to like take a step back, to make sure that I like treat people well in relationships and then return to it when I'm a bit more stable or whatever.
I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the way in which liberalism has inflected all sorts of ways in which we think about things. So it's not just about like democracy and but it's also about this idea of, well, there are certain spaces where other people and judgment and an idea of what you should do shouldn't really intrude. And it's sort of, I think about sex positive feminism as being really deeply liberal, where it's like, well, everything's fine if you want it, as if we are all masters of our own desires and clear on what they are, and all of our desires are good for us. I mean, like, many of my desires are very deeply self-destructive, like supporting Tottenham Hotspur, one of them.
Yeah.
And thinking about the way in which, I mean, you talked about Father Spiridon Bailey, and that, the message to young men is very much about the sins of the flesh and practicing sexual continence, which isn't just about having sex with other people, but also about masturbation and also about consuming porn. That part of it is a reaction to this, like, well, everything's fine, even the stuff that's clearly not.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that is the thing of seeing the fact that number of women who get raped continues to go up, like young kids in schools who are assaulting women, and this thing of saying, so often this is the case, right, with like loads of big problems in the world where there's the issue and then there's the question of, depending on the kind of person you are and your politics or the way you're thinking of what you think a solution is. And of course one solution is always like horror of like, things are not okay. But I think what I found, say, with interviewing Rico Tice was that his answer was, we need to be thinking about young men and how we support young men. And I think obviously part of that is true, but always, again, in my sense, everything is interrelational, where it's like, no, make sure that men and women are having a really good friendships and relationships and learning to respect each other when they're younger. Structural things of like how we're seeing women in media, how you're seeing, as well as how you're seeing your family treat women, that there's all these other answers to it. And this sense of like, okay, we're frightened, let's go back to celibacy. Like, if you're masturbating, that's wrong. To me, it feels wrong-headed, and it feels a quick reactionary response that doesn't serve a long-term solution or doesn't lead towards a long-term solution.
I mean, I suppose I'm not here to be the wank police and being like, this is too much, your hand's gonna fall off. Like, it's not that at all. But I've known many men who have had compulsive relationships towards sex, masturbation, and pornography, and it's left them feeling very empty and grubby, and it's significantly impeded their ability to form loving and, reciprocal relationships with women. And that it's sort of difficult because then they're caught between two extremes. Like, one is no masturbation, find God, young man. And then the other extreme is, well, who am I to say what the right amount of wanking is? And he's like, well, I don't know what the right amount is. All I know is that I'm doing the wrong amount.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's ever worked that we've said something is morally wrong as a way to stop people doing it. Like, I don't think that's, that would ever feel like an answer. But I think this thing of like, it relates to, I've been thinking so much about attention and addiction and this with social media, of when it's like me versus the tech bros who are much better than I am at making sure that I'm really staying on my phone. Like,
bypassing user awareness.
Exactly. And I think that with pornography, that all plays into it, where again, it's like, let's not put the onus on the individual. Like, same with addiction, like the fact that AA and NA, you recover in community with sponsors, with help, those are answers. Being able to put more limits on like how easy it is to access pornography. I don't know, that I basically just think that there's other answers than saying this is evil. I don't think that's going to help anyone. I don't think it is. And not to be the like masturbation anti-police, but like masturbation can be really beautiful and great. And you're right though, that as with many things, unfortunately some things can become addictive depending what's going on for you. And yeah,
I mean, I guess like broadening back out again, I mean, you spent a long time in lots of different religious settings. You're still the member of a church, you attend regularly. Do you think that we still live in a Christian country, or are we something different now?
I think there's the Tom Holland thing of saying that we are still a country that is steeped in Christian values or ways we think about ethics, that the monarchy is still the head of the church. But I think on like a day-to-day level, it doesn't feel like we're a Christian country. It feels like we're a deeply pluralistic country. And I think that the fact that as you go through London, you've got like mosques and synagogues and churches, and they're all, but I think then what that says is that we're a country that as all countries are, that like there is room for faith as like an aspect of the country. But I don't think, it doesn't feel like meaningfully everywhere we go that we're a Christian country. I don't think that is something that I would notice. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know, because I think about this a lot, which is despite the fact that I'm Muslim, or I would identify myself as Muslim, like I'm steeped in Christianity. I mean, I can quote a lot more Bible than I can Quran. I, celebrate Christmas more regularly than I do Eid. And also, there are probably all these things that I don't even think about in terms of, how is this a different system of moral authority that maybe I'm more aligned with than like Islamic jurisprudence, which I know basically nothing about. So from that perspective, I would go, I think we're a godless Christian country.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that the Tony Blair thing, if he was like, we don't do God, is that I think that despite the fact we don't have a separation of church and state the way that they do in the States, we're a lot more godless.
Yeah, I think that is really true. And I wonder, there's lots of stuff at the moment about with Gen Z, whether there's going to be this like return. They're talking about spirituality a lot more. And like, I don't want to like give a generalizing point about it, but I do think, I was trying to think about like why that might be. And I have this sense of what this like crisis point of things around technology. And I was thinking, I'm rarely ever bored these days, and that like there's always something to be taking my attention. That all forms of religion, but like thinking about Christianity particularly, are spaces in which you get to be a bit bored. And this idea that like you're not going to get somewhere transcendent without boredom, and that there's like this potentially this move to like not becoming more Christian again, but certainly being like, there are these spaces that exist that will make me feel more like an integrated person in the world again.
Or is it just because consumerism can't make demands of you there?
Yeah, I think so. And there was this thing that in the 90s, so part of wondering whether becoming a less Christian country is just like a kind of thing of like society progressing, which I don't really believe in the idea of like progressing society in lots of ways. But actually there was the relaxing of trade laws, which meant that people could then sell things on Sundays, and this sense of actually whether the decline in religion has this like capitalist consumerist reason behind it as well, which I found really interesting, where it is a space where no one's going to sell you anything, where you're probably going to have your phone away, and in that way it's quite a challenging space, and I think that's really comforting to a lot of people. And so I wonder then if we become a slightly more Christian country. I have no idea, and I'm not very good at making predictions with it. But I think you are right as well. I was thinking, I knew the Lord's Prayer from when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I know the like really good happy clappy songs that I learned in
Catholic
primary school.
version or Anglican version?
Anglican version. Was yours Catholic version?
Well, it's because a lot of my friends growing up, my best friend still Irish Catholic. So when, me and my friend met at uni, and she was like, tell me about your family. I was like, I'm Muslim. She's like, are you a Protestant Muslim or a Catholic Muslim? And I knew there was only one correct answer.
Catholic Muslim. Oh,
Catholic
that's so
Muslim.
good. That's so good. Yeah.
So I suppose my last question, it comes from, I think one of the final little bits of quotations in the book is from Love's Work, which is keep your mind in hell and despair not. And I was like, motherfucker, that's Gramsci. That is pessimism of the intellect. It's optimism of the will. And going through all this and reading and thinking about the search for purpose, for community, for a radically different world, has Madam considered communism?
Yes. I mean, I think, sorry, I said that in such an enthusiastic way. I think at the moment I would call myself a socialist. And I think, that line comes from Gillian Rose, Love's Work. And she's a Hegelian philosopher, and she was writing that book as she was dying of cancer. Her background was Jewish. Her family was Jewish, escaped the Holocaust. And she talks about this way that her mother, dealing with terrible trauma, was never able to face and speak about what happened to her, and therefore she lived in a kind of static despair. And Gillian Rose, who, it's the most beautiful book. It's all about the different people that she's loved, and that love has been the work of her life. That in those interactions, you have to sit with the horror, sit with the difficult things that are happening, and that's the only way you won't despair. And maybe faith is a good way of doing that, of saying, I have to deal with life as it is. I'm going to have to know myself better psychologically, emotionally, in order to like handle that the world is not as I want it to be. And I think, yeah, I've been interviewing all these Marxist and communist Christians recently for this piece, and they can so understand how those things work so well together. And in their churches, maybe sometimes they're seen as like this like oddball or the outlier, but being like, no, this radicality, this desire that is people first, that is working class, that is treating everyone equally, is something that we should be seeking in the world. And I think that's the other thing, is that then often Christianity can work quite well with Marxism, where it helps you with the why of like, why are we doing this? What is the world that we're looking for? And faith teaches us how to be imaginative about that, and also then brings
Which
in this
is the
hope.
opposite of what Marx said, though. I mean, he said the first step is you have to orbit yourself as your own sun, and you have to break with it. You have to embrace the science of historical change. I mean, are you like, nah?
No, I mean, I don't know enough about Marx. I wonder if those can still be compatible, of like what that means to break that, and then still thinking this need to achieve that then communally, like what that breaking that sense of like realizing what the world is, this materialist sense of it. How do we progress together? I don't know if I wonder if I think it can be compatible.
Well, look, jury's out.
Cheers out.
Lamorna Ash, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thank you so much. It was great and challenging, and yeah, wicked.